Hello and welcome, everyone, to today's live stream. We are covering chapter 19. This chapter will cover the Great Depression from 1929 to 1941. And what I'm showing you on screen is my website, my charity's website. It is www.tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled Tarpeia.us. And this is chapter 19 of the compendium. This is the third chapter of the World Wars era. The next chapter, which is going to be chapter 20, is the fourth and final chapter of the World Wars era, and that covers World War II. I'm going to be talking about that tomorrow. So today we're going to cover the Hoover administration and the first two terms of the FDR administration. So each of these has its own dedicated timeline, and on the timeline are primary source documents and events to give context to the time period. So let's begin with Hoover's administration. Who but Hoover? Hoover entered office celebrated as a master administrator, only to confront the greatest economic catastrophe in American history after the stock market crash of October 1929 shattered confidence and wiped out vast paper wealth. As banks failed, unemployment soared, and global trade collapsed, Hoover clung to voluntary cooperation and limited federal relief, even as the Smoot-Hawley tariff worsened the depression by strangling international commerce. The administration did sponsor large infrastructure projects, such as Boulder Hoover Dam, and created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, but these measures were widely seen as too cautious and too late to relieve mass suffering. Public despair hardened into anger during events like the Bonus Army's March on Washington, whose violent dispersal symbolized the widening gulf between federal authority and a desperate population. By 1933, Hoover's faith in rugged individualism had collapsed alongside the economy, leaving the nation ready for a fundamentally new leadership between government and a relationship between government and the American people. So we have Hoover's inaugural address given on March 4th, 1929. Upon taking office, President Herbert Hoover delivered an optimistic inaugural address emphasizing efficiency, scientific administration, voluntary cooperation, and the belief that poverty itself could soon disappear from America. The speech reflected Hoover's confidence in modern capitalism only months before the collapse of financial markets. So, bad timing. You have the Agricultural Marketing Act. This law created the Federal Farm Board and provided hundreds of millions of dollars intended to stabilize agricultural prices through government-backed cooperatives. It represented Hoover's early attempt to address the farm crisis through voluntary cooperation rather than direct federal intervention. We have the Hague Conference on Reparations. This is the first session in August of 1929. The first session centered around British demands for better terms and a larger share of the reparations payments for itself. Compromises, mostly on Germany's side, eventually resolved the issue. Outside of the formal Young Plan discussions, France agreed to an early withdrawal of the troops occupying the Rhineland in exchange for German concessions on reparations. Then you have the infamous October 24th, 1929, the Black Tuesday stock market crash, which the background of this section is a picture from that day. Of Hoover's 1929 State of the Union, he does not yet address the stock market crash. He thinks that it's just going to be another one of the boom-bust cycles, and the economy will bounce back. It won't be until later that Hoover will even acknowledge that there is a problem. You have the second session of the Hague Conference on Reparations in January of 1930. The second session, which took place after the Wall Street crash of October 1929, 29, set up the Bank for International Settlements to handle the transfer of payments between countries and settle the remaining Young Plan issues, despite sometimes furious objections from Germany's uh, hegemon. I don't know how to say that. Schocht. Then you have the Young Plan, an attempt to settle issues surrounding the World War I reparations obligations that Germany owed under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Hughes swears in as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. You have the Smoot-Hawley Tariff on June 17th, 1930, imposed high protective tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods, including agricultural products, manufactured goods, and raw materials, with the intention of shielding American farmers and industries from foreign competition during the early Great Depression. Instead of boosting the U.S. economy, it provoked retaliatory tariffs from other nations, deepened the global economic downturn, and worsened international trade collapse. President's Emergency Committee for Employment. Hoover organized business leaders and local governments to coordinate voluntary relief efforts rather than direct federal welfare programs. The committee reflected Hoover's preference for decentralized responses to economic hardship. You have Hoover's 1930 State of the Union, O'Gorman v. and Young, Inc. v. Hartford Fire Supreme Court decision. Hoover Dam construction begins in April 1931. Stromberg v. California Supreme Court decision. Near v. Minnesota. Hoover moratorium on war reparations. The Hoover moratorium was a proposed one-year suspension of intergovernmental war debts and reparation payments, including Germany's World War I reparation obligations and the repayment of war loans that the United States had extended to the Allies. Japan invades Manchuria, China. So this begins the Sino-Japanese War. Japan invaded Manchuria following the Mukden incident on the same day, a staged bombing of a Japanese-owned railway. The invasion was carried out by the Japanese Kwantung Army and was completed in February 1932, leading to the creation of the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo. UK abandons the gold standard in 1931. Britain's departure from the gold standard shocked international financial markets and intensified global monetary instability. The event increased pressure on the American financial system and contributed to worsening economic conditions. The National Credit Corporation created. Major banks organized the NCC to provide emergency liquidity to struggling financial institutions. The effort largely failed because banks were reluctant to risk capital while panic continued. Hoover's 1931 State of the Union address. Japanese bombing of Shanghai begins. You have the Stimson Doctrine. Secretary of State Henry L. Stimson announced that the United States would refuse to recognize territorial acquisitions achieved through force. The doctrine was directed primarily at Japanese expansion in China. Reconstruction Finance Corporation established. January of 1932. Congress created the RFC to provide emergency loans to banks, railroads, insurance companies, and other major institutions threatened by collapse. The RFC marked one of Hoover's largest federal interventions into the economy and later became a major instrument used by the Roosevelt administration. Now, the first Glass-Steagall Act. This earlier Glass-Steagall Act expanded Federal Reserve lending powers and loosened collateral requirements for banks. It was intended to increase liquidity during the banking crisis and should not be confused with the better-known 1933 banking law. Manchukuo is established, a Japanese puppet state in Manchuria. You have the Veteran Bonus March on DC. These are World War I veterans demanding their bonuses to be paid earlier, given the hardships of the Great Depression. The Revenue Act of 1932, one of the largest peacetime tax increases in American history, dramatically increasing income taxes, corporate taxes, estate taxes, and excise taxes. The legislation attempted to balance the federal budget amid collapsing revenues, but it often criticized for worsening the economic downturn. You have the Lausanne Conference, a meeting in Switzerland of representatives from the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Belgium, Japan, and Germany that resulted in an agreement to lower Germany's World War I reparations obligations as imposed by the Treaty of Versailles and the 1929 Young Plan. The reduction of approximately 90% was made as a result of the difficult economic circumstances during the Great Depression. The Lausanne Treaty never came into effect. The Lausanne Conference marked the de facto end of Germany's reparations payments until after World War II. The Lindbergh Act, Federal Kidnapping Act, after the kidnapping and murder of Lindbergh Jr., a toddler of a famous aviator, Congress expanded the FBI's authority by making kidnapping a federal crime. The Emergency Relief and Construction Act. This legislation expanded the RFC's authority by permitting loans for public works projects and limited relief programs. It represented a shift away from Hoover's early reluctance to use federal funds for direct economic assistance. We have the 1932 Federal Home Loan Bank Act. The law established a system of federally supported home loan banks intended to provide liquidity to mortgage lenders. It was designed to slow foreclosures and stabilize the collapsing housing market. U.S. troops are sent under Patton and I think also MacArthur to break up the veteran camp outside D.C. Have Hoover's acceptance speech at the 1932 RNC. We actually have the audio from that speech. That's almost 100 years old. We have Powell v. Alabama, a Supreme Court case on the Scottsboro Boys. And the election of FDR. FDR, the Democrat, he beats Herbert Hoover, the Republican. Hoover's 1932 State of the Union Address. 12th Amendment is ratified. The amendment shortened the lame duck period by moving presidential inaugurations from March to, or sorry, not 12th, 20th Amendment ratified, moving presidential inaugurations from March to January. Although ratified near the end of Hoover's term, it was largely a response to problems exposed during the long transition period. During this time, Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor by the German President Paul von Hindenburg. So here's an image of Hitler and Hindenburg. Pretty early on, you have the Reichstag fire, which was blamed on communists, and which led to the Reichstag fire decree. The decree nullified many of the key civil liberties of German citizens. With the Nazis in powerful positions in the German government, the decree was used as the legal basis for the imprisonment of anyone considered to be opponents of the Nazis and to suppress publications not considered friendly to the Nazi cause. And that concludes this section, Who But Hoover, which covers the Hoover administration. Now we go to the next section, 1933 to 1941, on the New Deal. This is the first two presidential terms of the Hoover administration. Excuse me. So let me read the description See, FDR entered office amid economic collapse and social despair, and his administration quickly redefined the relationship between the federal government, the economy, and ordinary Americans through an unprecedented wave of legislation known as the New Deal. Early emergency measures such as the Emergency Banking Act and Glass-Steagall Act stabilized finance, while programs like the CCC, PWA, TVA, and WPA mobilized millions for public works, providing employment and getting the economy running. New Deal ideas were fiercely contested as critics like Huey Long, Father Charles Coughlin, and Francis Townsend demanded more radical wealth redistribution, while conservatives warned of creeping socialism and threats to constitutional government. The Supreme Court initially resisted New Deal reforms, prompting Roosevelt's failed court packing plan, but landmark measures such as the Social Security Act, Wagner Act, and Fair Labor Standards Act institutionalized labor rights, welfare, and regulation. By the 1940s, the New Deal had not ended the Depression entirely, but it permanently altered American political culture, laying the foundations of the modern welfare state just as global war loomed and economic mobilization began to revive the American industry. So we have FDR's first inaugural address, and we have the video, or at least the audio, of it that you can watch. We have the Emergency Banking Act, reopened solvent banks under federal supervision after the nationwide bank holiday. FDR gave us his first fireside chat on March 12th, 1933. This one covers the banking crisis. The Economy Act of 1933 cut federal salaries and veterans' benefits to reduce the deficit. If the Beer Wine Revenue Act legalized low-alcohol beer and wine, generating tax revenue ahead of full repeal of Prohibition. Law to remedy the distress of the people and the Reich, Enabling Act. The law was published and came into effect the following day, March 24th, 1933. This act was a pivotal moment in the establishment of Adolf Hitler's dictatorship, as it allowed the Chancellor and his cabinet to enact laws without the consent of the Parliament or the President, effectively dismantling Germany's democratic Weimar Constitution. Japan leaves the League of Nations. Federal Surplus Relief Corporation distributed surplus food and goods to the needy. FDR's fireside chat number 2, second fireside chat, on the New Deal program. And this will include the Federal Emergency Relief Act, provided direct federal relief funds to states for the unemployed. Cultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, paid farmers to reduce production to raise crop prices. Tennessee Valley Authority Act, the TVA, created a federally owned corporation to develop the Tennessee Valley. Let's see, what's that? Securities Act of 1933 required transparency in the sale of stocks and bonds. The Civilian Conservation Corps Act, the CCC, created jobs for young men in environmental conservation. The Public Works Administration, the PWA, funded large-scale infrastructure projects. You have the Homeowners Loan Act, the HOLC, helped homeowners refinance mortgages to prevent foreclosure. You have the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, established industrial codes and created the NRA and PWA. You have the Glass-Steagall Act, created the FDIC and separated commercial and investment banking. That would be repealed under the Clinton administration. You have the Farm Credit Act, provided credit relief to struggling farmers. During this time, you have Prohibition still going on. That's not been lifted yet. And so there's a lot of mob violence going on like this. The Kansas City Massacre. Gangsters led by Vernon Miller attempted to free captured mobster Frank Nash at Union Station, resulting in a shootout. that left 5 men dead, including 4 law enforcement officers and 2 injured. The bloodshed shocked the nation and directly led to expanding the FBI's powers, allowing agents to carry firearms and make arrests, transforming it into a modern national law enforcement agency. You have FDR's fireside chat number 3 on the National Recovery Administration. Hitler announces Germany's withdrawal from the League of Nations. FDR's fireside chat number 4 on economic progress. Germany officially leaves the League of Nations. One of the major dust storms during this time. FDR's 1934 State of the Union address. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934. This act centralized gold holdings in the federal government and allowed devaluation of the dollar to combat deflation. You have Nabia v. New York, a Supreme Court decision. The Philippine Independence Act. This is to provide or to grant more independence for the territory of the Philippines. Major dust storms reached New York City and D.C. in May of 1934. You have the Securities Exchange Act, created the SEC, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission, to regulate the stock market and prevent abuses that contributed to the Great Depression. You have the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, empowered the president to negotiate tariff reductions with other nations, marking a shift away from high protection policies such as the Smoot-Hawley tariff. You have the Communications Act of 1934. This statute reorganized federal communications regulation by creating the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and consolidating authority over interstate and foreign communication by wire and radio under a single independent agency. It also allows the president to take control of communications infrastructure during war/emergency. You have the National Housing Act, established the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, to ensure mortgages stabilize the housing market and expand home ownership. FDR's fireside chat number 5 about New Deal critics. We have the law concerning the head of state of the German Reich. This law stipulated that upon Hindenburg's death, the offices of president and chancellor would be merged, and the president and the powers of the president would be transferred to Adolf Hitler, who would use the title of Führer and Reich Chancellor. Hitler becomes president of Germany following Hindenburg's death, which happens shortly after the law about transferring power. Very convenient. Hitler becomes president of Germany following Hindenburg's death. A German plebiscite elects Hitler as Führer. Hitler was confirmed by a public referendum, which he won with 90% of the vote, and adopted the title of Führer. You have FDR's 6th fireside chat on government and capitalism. FDR's 1935 State of the Union address. Patterson v. Alabama, one of several Supreme Court decisions on the Scottsboro Boys. The Emergency Work Relief Appropriations Act authorized billions in federal funding for large-scale work relief programs, most notably creating the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, to employ millions of jobless Americans. Signed by FDR during the Great Depression, it marked a shift from direct aid to federally funded employment through public works, arts, and infrastructure projects. You have Black Sunday, where 20 dust storms occurred throughout the country. You have FDR's 7th fireside chat on worker relief and Social Security. Huey Long gives his St. Vitus Dance government radio address, complaining about the New Deal politics and about FDR particularly. You have the Franco-Soviet Pact signed. Railroad Retirement Board v. Alton Railroad Co. The court struck down a federal law establishing pensions for railroad workers. It ruled the law was not a valid regulation of interstate commerce. It violated the Due Process Clause by imposing unjustified costs on employers. You have the Cheshire Poultry Corps v. U.S. This case struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA. The court ruled that Congress had unconstitutionally delegated legislative power to the president. The federal government overreached the Commerce Clause since the poultry business was considered intrastate as opposed to interstate. So we have the Supreme Court of the United States is shooting down New Deal policies. You have the Louisville Joint Stock Land Bank v. Radford. The court invalidated the Fraser-Lemke Farm Bankruptcy Act, which helped farmers avoid foreclosure. It held that the law violated the Fifth Amendment by taking property from creditors without just compensation. You have the National Labor Relations Act, guaranteed workers the right to unionize and bargain collectively, created the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB. You have the Social Security Act of 1935, established a federal system of old age pensions, unemployment insurance, and aid to dependent and disabled Americans, creating the foundation of the modern U.S. welfare state. Signed by FDR during the Great Depression, it aimed to provide long-term economic security and reduce poverty among the elderly and unemployed. And we actually have a video of FDR signing the Social Security Act. Now, the Revenue Act of 1935 increased taxes on high incomes, corporations, and large inheritances to address inequality and also deficit. You have the Neutrality Act of 1935 imposed an arms embargo on all belligerents in wars and authorized the president to warn U.S. citizens against traveling on belligerent ships. Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, which begins in October of 1935. FDR's 1936 State of the Union address. United States v. Butler. This case struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. The court ruled that agricultural regulation was a state, not federal power. It also held that the federal government's use of taxes and subsidies to control agriculture was unconstitutional. Now, the February 26 incident, nationalists in Japan assassinate moderate leaders, Saito Makoto, Watanabe Jotaro, and Takahashi Korikyo, but the coup fails and the ringleaders are executed. You have the Neutrality Act of 1936, extended the 1935 Act for another year and prohibited loans to or credits to belligerents. These are any countries that are at war with another country. Now, Hoover Dam construction finishes. Hitler reoccupies the Rhineland. Haile Selassie addresses the League of Nations. He is the king of Ethiopia, and he addresses the League of Nations for relief from Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. Carter v. Carter Co. The court invalidated the Coal Conservation Act, which regulated wages and hours in coal mining. It ruled that production, mining, was not interstate commerce, even if the coal would later be sold across state lines. Moorhead v. New York ex rel. Tebaldo. The court struck down a state minimum wage law for women. It relied on the doctrine of freedom of contract under the Due Process Clause. The Spanish Civil War begins in July of 1936. While this is happening, you have the Summer Olympics held in Berlin in August of 1936. Germany won most medals, with a total of 101. Second place is the United States with 57. So a lot of people like to mention the some of the specific events during the 1936 Summer Olympics without mentioning the fact that Germany won the most medals, almost double what second place the United States won. And this also took place in Germany. FDR gives his I Hate War speech in August of 1936. FDR's Fireside Chat. Number 8, about drought farmers and laborers. You have the Italo-German Protocol. The creation of the Axis powers. The main focus of discussions was on the Spanish Civil War, the only area in which Germany and Italy were actively cooperating. In the protocol, the two sides agreed to resist the renewal of the Locarno treaties to align their attitudes towards the League of Nations, of which only Italy was still a member, and to pursue economic cooperation in the Danube basin. Germany agreed to recognize Italy's conquest of Ethiopia, and Italy agreed to support the restoration of Germany's colonies, lost in the First World War. Italy also accepted the Austro-German Accord of July 11th, 1936, which normalized relations between Germany and Austria. After Mussolini announces the Rome-Berlin Axis, so this is where we get the term Axis powers. It was coined by Mussolini. You have the re-election of FDR. He wins over Alf Landon. King Edward VIII abdicates so he can marry Wallis Simpson. You have FDR's 1937 State of the Union address. Japan withdraws from the Washington Naval Treaty. This ends Japan's commitment to the Naval Limitations Agreement agreed upon after World War I, signaling its militarization and expansionist intent. The Washington Naval Treaty is the Five Powers Treaty. You have FDR's second inaugural address. Judicial Procedures Reform Bill. So Roosevelt, FDR, will propose adding new justices to the Supreme Court after decisions like the Schechter Poultry Corps v. United States and United States v. Butler had struck down key New Deal laws. The plan ultimately failed in Congress, but during the controversy, the court shifted its stance in what became known as the switch in time that saved 9, upholding New Deal legislation going forward. So the Supreme Court will not be targeting the New Deal program from here on out, at least not as much as it did during FDR's first term. We have FDR's Fireside Chat number 9 on the reorganization of the judiciary. Italy formally withdraws from the League of Nations in 1937. Mussolini completes Italy's diplomatic break with collective security after the League's sanctions over the invasion of Ethiopia. You have West Coast Hotel Co. v. Parrish. Court upheld a state minimum wage law, reversing its earlier stance. NLRB v. J&L Steel Corp. upheld the Wagner Act, vastly expanding federal power under the Commerce Clause. Of the Neutrality Act of 1937, expanded embargoes to include civil wars, for example, Spain, continued the arms embargo, and established the cash and carry policy for non-military goods, which means that other countries have to pay in cash for American resources, and they have to be the ones to carry it out of the country so that we don't have to pay for the transportation. Roosevelt's recession begins in May of 1937. Roosevelt recession was a sharp economic downturn that interrupted recovery during the late New Deal. It was triggered in part by reduced federal spending, tighter monetary policy, and efforts to balance the budget, leading to a sudden rise in unemployment and industrial decline within the broader context of the Great Depression. The downturn exposed the fragility of the recovery and led Roosevelt to reverse course in 1938, which renewed deficit spending and expanded federal intervention. And the infamous Hindenburg disaster, which occurs in New Jersey in May of 1937. Neville Chamberlain becomes Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he will start the policy of appeasement towards Germany and Italy, seeking peace through compromise. And the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing, China. The Japanese and Chinese troops clash outside Beijing, marking the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, often considered the true start of World War II in Asia, all the way back in 1937. The Senate Judiciary Committee's report on the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill. The U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee issues a negative report, officially condemning the bill as unnecessary and dangerous to constitutional separation of powers. The bill will never pass Congress and is effectively dead by November 22nd. Battle of Shanghai begins, one of the largest and bloodiest early battles of the Sino-Japanese War. Chinese resistance surprises Japan, escalating the conflict into total war. You have FDR's quarantine speech, try to quarantine violent and belligerent nations in Asia. FDR's fireside chat, number 10, which is an update on the New Deal. You have the Hausbach memorandum recorded in Berlin, or the Hausbach memorandum recorded in Berlin. At a secret meeting, Hitler reveals plans for expansion, Austria and Czechoslovakia first, laying the blueprint for German aggression. The minutes are later used as evidence at Nuremberg. FDR's fireside chat number 11 on the employment crisis, on the unemployment census. U.S. gunboat Panay, sunk by Japanese aircraft on the Yangtze River. Though Japan apologizes, the incident increases U.S.-Japanese tensions and foreshadows later conflict in the Pacific. You have the Nanking Massacre, or known as the Rape of Nanking. Following Japan's capture of Nanking, its troops committed mass atrocities against Chinese civilians and POWs. An estimated 200,000 to 300,000 are killed, shocking the world and deepening anti-Japanese sentiment. FDR's 1938 State of the Union address. He talks about the growing wars around the world. German troops march into Austria, and Germany will annex Austria on March 13th, 1938, and they were welcomed with open arms by the Austrians. You have FDR's number 12 fireside chat on the recession. That's the Roosevelt recession going on. You have U.S. v. Carolyn Products Co., a Supreme Court decision. May crisis in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia partially mobilizes its army after false reports of German troop movements near its border. Britain and France pressure Hitler to calm the situation, revealing both their fear of war and their unwillingness to resist German threats militarily. FDR's fireside chat number 13 on the primaries. That's for the midterms. A Fair Labor Standards Act. You have the Avon Conference. Representatives from 32 nations met in Avon-les-Bains, France, to discuss the growing Jewish refugee crisis caused by Nazi persecution. Almost no country agrees to increase immigration quotas, demonstrating the world's indifference to the plight of Jews at this time. Hitler denounces Czechoslovakia. Hitler publicly denounces at a Nuremberg rally Czechoslovakia for allegedly oppressing ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland, inflaming tensions, and preparing public opinion for intervention. Chamberlain meets Hitler on September 15th, 1938, and this will lead to the Munich Agreement. So you have the British diplomats, Hitler representing Germany, and then you have the Italian diplomats wearing their black shirts at the Munich conference. So this agreement between Germany, Italy, Great Britain, and France allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of peace from Hitler. Chamberlain returns to England to announce peace in our time. So I have a video of Chamberlain giving his speech. This is about the Munich Agreement. Germany annexes the Sudetenland. That is the outskirts of Czechoslovakia. You have Kristallnacht, a state-sanctioned pogrom across Germany and Austria. Synagogues burned, Jewish businesses destroyed, and about 30,000 Jews arrested and sent to concentration camps. This marks a turning point from discrimination to systemic persecution. You have FDR's 1939 State of the Union address, Hitler's Reichstag speech. Hitler declares that today Germany, tomorrow the world, signaling his open expansionist ambitions. He invades Czechoslovakia in March of 1939, and Czechoslovakia becomes a German protectorate. Britain and France guarantee Poland independence, although they won't be doing much after Germany invades Poland. Italy invades Albania. You have the Marian Anderson concert at the Lincoln Memorial because she had been barred from performing at Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution. The concert was organized by Eleanor Roosevelt as an open-air performance on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial with the support of the U.S. government and the Secretary of the Interior. The performance by Marian Anderson before a crowd of more than 75,000 people, both black and white, mixed together in the crowd, and became a landmark moment in American civil rights history. FDR appeals to Hitler and Mussolini. His famous radio appeal for peace to Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, delivered as part of a broader message asking European leaders to guarantee the independence of several nations and avoid further aggression following the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. Hitler gives an infamous response to FDR, and so in the speech, Hitler reads out all the nations that FDR told him not to invade, and it's like this very long list, and the Germans start laughing. It's like, oh, FDR thinks that we can invade all these countries? Well, maybe we can. We'll see. And he ended up doing most of it, invading most of those countries anyway. You have the U.S. v. Miller, a Supreme Court decision on firearms in the 1930s. You have the Pact of Steel signed. Germany and Italy signed the Pact of Steel, a formal military and political alliance committing them to mutual support in case of war. You have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, an agreement between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. After that is agreed to, Germany invades Poland on the 1st of September 1939. Britain and France declare war on Germany, although they don't send any troops yet. FDR's Fireside Chat number 14 on the European War. Russia invades Poland. Warsaw falls to Germany. Poland surrenders and is partitioned between the USSR and Germany. And the Neutrality Act of 1939 repealed the arms embargo for belligerents, allowed sale of weapons on a cash and carry basis to countries at war, primarily Britain and France. You have the Franco-German Declaration. France and Germany sign a non-aggression declaration as both nations seek to stabilize relations temporarily, though Hitler views it as another diplomatic victory. So even though France declares war on Germany for invading Poland, France will make an agreement with Germany on non-aggression to each other. So the French, especially the French, but also the French and British diplomatic shenanigans that is going on at this time really doesn't make any sense. They both declare war on Germany, and then they both do nothing and make agreements for peace, at least temporarily, and that will only give Hitler and the Germans more time to prepare for their invasion of the West. You have FDR's 1940 State of the Union address. The USSR invades Finland, starting the Winter War. You have the sinking of the Altmark. British forces free prisoners held by a German supply ship in Norwegian waters. Moscow Peace Treaty with Finland, ending the Winter War. Germany invades Denmark and Norway. Operation Weserübung. Germany occupies Denmark and Norway to secure strategic ports and iron ore shipments. Denmark surrenders the same day. Churchill becomes Prime Minister on May 10th, 1940, and on the same day, May 10th, 1940, Germany invades Western Europe, including the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Belgium surrenders just 8 days later. FDR's Fireside Chat, number 15 on national defense. And the Dunkirk evacuation, which is Operation Dynamo. Never Surrender speech by Churchill. Now this speech was not recorded, but Churchill will, after the war, do a separate recording after the fact. And we have that recording on our website. And the Mussolini, he declares war on Britain and France, opening the Mediterranean front. At the stab in the back speech by FDR, talking about European powers going to war with each other, even though he's been advocating that they shouldn't go to war at all. You have Paris falls to Germany on June 14th, 1940. An armistice signed between Germany and France. You have the Smith Act, the Alien Registration Act, required all non-U.S. citizens, adults, to register with the federal government, reflected concerns over subversive activities, criminalized advocating overthrow of government, used against left-wing dissident Japanese residents and later Communist Party USA. You have the start of the Battle of Britain, where the Luftwaffe begins its attacks on shipping convoys and ports in the English Channel. FDR gives an acceptance speech during the Democratic Party's National Convention. You have Eagle Day, major Luftwaffe attacks on the RAF airfields, radar stations, and infrastructure, and this will lead into the Blitz. And the Luftwaffe shifts focus to bombing London and other cities. Sustained nightly bombing begins. You have the Selective Training and Service Act. That's the Selective Service. Is created in 1940. You have the Tripartite Pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan. And this creates the Axis powers as we know it. Italy invades Greece on October of 1940. The election of FDR versus, he wins against Wendell Willkie. And then you have Churchill announces the bombing of German cities. Britain begins planning strategic bombing campaigns against German industrial and civilian targets following the Blitz. You have FDR's Fireside Chat number 16, The Arsenal of Democracy, an interesting speech. FDR's 1941 State of the Union address, where he talks about the four freedoms. I'm going to have to look them up again, but the four freedoms of FDR is like freedom of religion, freedom of want from like scarcity of food, freedom of movement, freedom to work, or something like that. So there's four freedoms, and this is presidents at this time, starting with like maybe Teddy, going into Woodrow Wilson, going into FDR, talk about establishing more freedoms, more rights of people on their own without an amendment to the Constitution, which is, to me, the only proper way to add rights to our society is through the amending process, not through executive protocol or whatever, executive orders. If FDR, he proposes the Lend-Lease Bill to Congress, and this will be passed in the next section, which is FDR's third term, which will cover World War II in its entirety. And this Lend-Lease will be very important when it comes to funding Britain and China, and also the Soviet Union during World War II. And this concludes today's live stream. This chapter has been chapter 19, which covered the Great Depression from 1929 to 1941. This is the third chapter of the World Wars era. Tomorrow, I will cover the fourth and final chapter of the World Wars era, which is chapter 20, World War II, from 1941 to 1945. So if you are interested in World War II history, stay tuned for that. And if you're interested in looking at this website that I've been showing you, this is our charity's website. It is www.tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled TARPEIA.us, and I have a link in the description. And this specifically is chapter 19 of the Compendium. So if you look at the Compendium, go to the World Wars era, this has been the Great Depression. So tomorrow we'll be covering World War II from 1941 to 1945. We are an educational nonprofit, a 501c3, and all donations are tax deductible. You can even sponsor an era of research and get your name on our website. And so if you want to sponsor an era, or if you just want to donate a small amount of money, or maybe a large amount of money, just let me know. If you do want to donate a large amount of money from like a DAF, then you can email me at mark@tarpeia.us, Mark with a K at Tarpeia, TARPEIA.us, and I'll send you information like our address and EIN and any other information that you're going to need for donating through a DAF, a donor advised fund. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you on tomorrow's live stream. So thank you, have a nice day, and bye-bye.